Right now, as you're watching this, somewhere under your feet, a drill bit is grinding its way through solid rock. Somewhere else, a bucket the size of a bus is tearing another 100 tons of ore out of a mountain. And somewhere else, a pump is pulling ancient water out of the ground faster than rain could ever put it back. Every single year, humanity removes more than 100 billion tons of material from this planet. Rock, coal, metal, oil, gas, sand, water. 100 billion tons every year. And that number is still climbing. So here's the question almost nobody asks. If we have been doing this for a century and a half, where's the hole? Why isn't there a crater? Why doesn't the ground under our cities simply give way? Why is the Earth still exactly the same shape? The answer is stranger than any hole in the ground. Because the planet doesn't collapse from the mass we take out of it. It collapses from something else we take without ever noticing. And in a handful of places, it already has. Let's start with the scale, because the scale is genuinely hard to hold in your head. Right now, there are more than 100,000 active oil wells pulling crude out of the ground around the world. Together, they lift close to 100 million barrels of oil every single day. Since the first commercial well was drilled in Pennsylvania in 1859, we have taken roughly 1.5 trillion barrels of oil out of the crust of this planet. Now add the coal, add the iron, the copper, the bauxite, sand, the limestone. The United Nations puts total global material extraction above 100 billion tons a year, up from 30 billion in 1970, and projects it will reach 160 billion by 2060. That is the largest earth-moving operation in the history of life on this planet. Nothing else comes close. Not glaciers, not rivers, us. So you would expect the surface to show it. And here's the first surprise. On the scale of the planet, it barely registers at all. Earth weighs roughly 6 billion trillion tons. Everything humanity digs up in an entire year is about 1/60 billionth of that. If the Earth were an apple, we haven't broken the skin. We haven't even scratched the wax on the skin. The deepest hole human beings have ever drilled is the Kola Super Deep Borehole in northern Russia. 20 years of effort, 12,262 meters straight down. That is about 0.19% of the distance to the center of the Earth. Not 2%, 0.19. And at that depth, the rock stopped behaving like rock. It became so hot and so plastic that it flowed back into the shaft like tar. The Earth quietly healed the hole by itself. So on a planetary scale, we are ants. But we don't live on a planetary scale. We live on top of very specific pieces of ground. And that is exactly where this story gets uncomfortable.
Because to understand what happens when we take something out, you first have to understand what was actually down there. If I told you there was a lake of oil under your feet, you would probably picture a black underground sea, a cavern. Drill into it and a geyser shoots into the sky. That's Hollywood. That is not how any of this works. Oil isn't stored in caves. It is trapped inside billions of microscopic pores inside solid rock, sandstone and limestone, the same way water is trapped inside the sponge next to your kitchen sink. Now imagine that sponge isn't the size of your hand. It is a rock formation stretching for miles, buried 2 miles down. And every one of those tiny holes is filled with crude oil under enormous pressure. The same is true for groundwater. There is no underground river beneath most cities. There is saturated rock and clay, holding water in the spaces between the grains. So when a well starts producing, nothing empties out like a bathtub. No room forms. The pores are all still there. What changes is the pressure inside them. And pressure, it turns out, is the thing that was holding the ground up. Squeeze the water out of a sponge, and it doesn't leave a hole in your hand. It shrinks. It gets thinner. That is exactly what happens to a reservoir. First by microns, then millimeters, then centimeters. The grains repack, the rock compacts, and the entire layer becomes very slightly thinner. Now stretch that layer across 20 square miles and put a city on top of it. The ground doesn't crack open. It doesn't swallow a bus. It sinks. Slowly, evenly, invisibly. Geologists call it land subsidence, and for decades nobody even noticed it was happening because you cannot see a city sinking while you are standing on it, but you can measure it, and the measurements are terrifying. Long Beach, California, in the 1940s. The city sits directly on top of the Wilmington oil field, one of the largest oil fields ever discovered in the United States. Hundreds of wells running around the clock. At first, everything looked completely normal. Then engineers started noticing strange things. Roads developing dips that were never designed. Railroad tracks slowly warping out of line. Pipelines shearing apart at the joints. And seawater quietly creeping into the harbor over docks that used to sit well above the waterline. People blamed bad construction, bad soil, bad luck. The real cause was hundreds of feet underground. As
oil came out, pressure in the reservoir dropped, and the rock beneath the port began compacting under its own weight. By 1951, the ground was dropping more than 2 feet per year. In total, the center of that subsidence bowl went down about 29 feet, 9 meters, roughly a 3-story building across more than 20 square miles. Parts of a major American port had simply sunk below the sea. If a story like this is your kind of thing, take 1 second and subscribe. It really does help. Now, back underground. The fix, once they finally understood the problem, was almost absurdly simple. If you take fluid out, you have to put fluid back in. Starting in 1953, engineers began pumping salt water back down into the Wilmington field through dedicated injection wells. It became the largest water flood program in the world. Pressure came back, the compaction stopped, the sinking stopped, and there was a bonus. The injected water pushed extra oil toward the production wells, oil that otherwise would have stayed locked in the rock forever. Problem solved, except it wasn't, because putting fluid back into the ground turned out to have consequences of its own. Oil never comes up alone. It comes up mixed with enormous volumes of extremely salty, contaminated water, often several barrels of water for every single barrel of oil. That water has to go somewhere. The cheapest option is to pump it back down, deep, into porous rock far below the drinking water. For a long time, that looked harmless. Then Oklahoma happened. Before 2009, Oklahoma was a seismically boring place. On average, it recorded about 1 magnitude 3 earthquake per year. Then disposal volumes climbed, and by 2015, Oklahoma recorded 888 earthquakes of magnitude 3 or greater in a single year, more than 2 a day. A state that used to feel 1 noticeable quake a year was suddenly outshaking California in raw numbers. Here is the mechanism, and it is not what most people assume. The water was not blowing the rock apart, it was lubricating it. Deep underground, there are ancient faults, cracks in the basement rock that have been locked together by friction for thousands of years. They are already loaded with stress. They simply can't move because the 2 sides are pressed together too hard. Pump high-pressure fluid into that zone, and the pressure inside the fault pushes those 2 rock faces very slightly apart. Friction drops, and a fault that had been stuck for millennia finally slips. The energy that came out was never ours. It was already stored in the rock. We just removed the parking brake. Oklahoma regulators eventually forced injection volumes down, and the earthquake rate fell with them. The link was that direct. Now, take oil out of the story completely, because the largest subsidence disasters on Earth have nothing to do with oil. They are about water. California's San Joaquin Valley. Farmers began pumping groundwater heavily in the 1920s. By 1970, more than half the valley, around 5,200 square miles, had dropped by at least a foot. In the worst spots, the land fell 28 feet. Canals built dead level now effectively run uphill. Aqueducts engineered to move water by gravity have lost their slope. Hundreds of millions of dollars in repairs because the ground itself moved. And Mexico City is worse. The city is built on the bed of a drained lake, on roughly 100 meters of fine clay. Pump the water out from under that clay, and the grains pack tighter and tighter permanently. Parts of Mexico City are sinking close to 50 centimeters a year, 20 inches every year. That is not a projection. It is measured by satellite radar and GPS. And the research is blunt about the worst part. It is irreversible. Even if you refilled the aquifer tomorrow, that clay will never expand again. The storage capacity is simply gone. Pavements tilt, buildings crack and lean into each other. Drainage designed to flow one direction now runs backwards because the ground beneath it changed shape. And then there's the one case where the ground really does open up. That happens when the void is real, when we have physically removed solid rock, not just pressure. Kiruna, in northern Sweden. For over a century, the largest underground iron mine on Earth has been eating the rock beneath the town. As the ore body is hollowed out, the ground above deforms and cracks, and that deformation zone keeps creeping toward the city. The solution was not to engineer the ground. It was to move the town. 6,000 people, 2,700 homes. A brand new city center opened 3 kilometers east in 2022, and they even moved the 113-year-old wooden church down the road, intact. The bill runs to about 2 billion euros. Or Bayou Corn, Louisiana, 2012. A brine company had been mining salt out of a salt dome, leaving a huge man-made cavern underground. The outer wall of that cavern failed. Sediment poured in, oil and gas escaped upward, and the bayou itself started bubbling. Then, on the 3rd of August, a hole opened at the surface. At first, it was about the size of a tennis court. It kept growing. Today, it covers roughly 37 acres and is at least 750 feet deep. 350 residents were evacuated. Most of them never came back. And the biggest hole we have ever dug on purpose, Bingham Canyon in Utah,
Utah, 4 kilometers across, more than 1.2 kilometers deep, and visible from orbit. The single largest man-made excavation on the planet. That one didn't collapse. We simply kept carrying it away, one truckload at a time, for more than a century. So why doesn't the Earth collapse? Because we are not hollowing out the planet. We never were.
On a planetary scale, everything we have ever extracted is a rounding error on a rounding error. The crust alone is 30 to 70 kilometers thick, and our deepest borehole barely made it a third of the way through the thinnest part. We are not removing the Earth, we are removing its internal pressure, and that pressure is what holds the pore space open in the rock directly beneath our roads, our ports, and our cities. That is the real trade, not mass, support. The places that sank, cracked, and shook are the places where we took the pressure out and put nothing back. The places that stabilized are the ones where engineers finally understood that if you take fluid out, something has to go back in. Taking things out of the Earth is easy. It always has been. Keeping the balance underneath is the actual engineering problem. And we are still learning that lesson, one sinking city at a time.